There is a moment in Blazing Saddles where Gene Wilder does almost nothing. He's lying in a jail cell, half upside down, staring at the ceiling with the vacant calm of a man who has completely made peace with the world falling apart around him. No big jokes, no physical comedy, just a quiet, almost eerie stillness. And somehow, it's one of the funniest things in the entire film. Most people laugh and move on. But Wilder knew exactly what he was doing in that moment and why it worked. He understood something about this movie that most audiences never quite put into words, even after 50 years of watching it. He understood that Blazing Saddles wasn't really a Western parody. It wasn't really a racial satire. It was something stranger and more dangerous than either of those things. And the way he played the Waco Kid was his quiet, understated proof. Gene Wilder did not plan to be in Blazing Saddles. He wasn't on the original casting list. He wasn't being considered for the Waco Kid when production began. He was a last resort, called in under emergency circumstances after the first actor cast in the role had to be removed before filming even properly started. That actor was Gig Young, an Oscar-winning veteran of Hollywood drama with decades of credits behind him. On paper, Young was a logical choice. The Waco Kid is a former legend, a gunslinger who was once the fastest draw in the West and is now a hollow, broken man hiding from his own reputation at the bottom of a bottle. Young had the weathered face and the dramatic range. He looked like someone history had chewed up and spat out. The problem was that Young wasn't acting. He was genuinely in the grip of severe alcoholism, and by the time production began, he was in the middle of acute withdrawal. On his very first day, during the simple scene where the Waco Kid is discovered hanging upside down in a jail cell, crew members realized something was deeply wrong. Young was shaking uncontrollably. He could not get through the scene. Production stopped. Mel Brooks made the call quickly and without hesitation. Young was let go, and the role was suddenly urgently open. Brooks called Gene Wilder. They had worked together before on The Producers, and Brooks trusted Wilder's instincts in a way he trusted very few actors. When he described the character over the phone, a burned-out gunfighter with a drinking problem, a gentle absurdist streak, and an unexpected moral core, Wilder said yes without reading a single page of a script. He flew out the next day. He walked onto a set already mid-production, already charged with the specific energy that a Mel Brooks shoot generated, and he started filming almost immediately. What he delivered in those first few days set the tone for everything his character would become. Here is what Gene Wilder said in interviews about the Waco Kid that most fans never fully absorbed. He did not play the character as a comic sidekick. He did not play him as a drunk or a joke or a man who existed to make Bart look good by comparison. He played him as someone who had seen too much of the world and found it genuinely funny. Not funny in a lighthearted way. Funny in the way that something is funny when it is so deeply broken that laughing is the only honest response left. Wilder described the Waco Kid as a man who arrived at a kind of enlightenment through failure. He had been the best in the world at something, and the world had rewarded him with misery. He had been famous, feared, and respected, and none of it had meant anything. So he gave up. He retreated. He let himself become invisible. And somewhere in that retreat, he stumbled onto a kind of clarity that the ambitious, striving people around him completely lacked. When Bart arrives in the jail cell and the two men begin to talk, the Waco Kid is not confused by the absurdity of a black sheriff in the racist Old West. He is the only person in the entire town who is not confused by it, because he has already stopped expecting the world to make sense. That is the secret engine of the Waco Kid's relationship with Bart, and it is the thing most people miss when they describe Blazing Saddles as a buddy comedy. It is not a buddy comedy in the traditional sense. It is a film about two people who are both outsiders, but for completely different reasons and who recognize each other across that difference. Bart is an outsider because the world refuses to see him clearly. The Waco Kid is an outsider because he sees the world too clearly. Between those two positions, the film finds its emotional center. Wilder was deliberate about this. He made a specific choice to underplay nearly every scene. Where another actor might have pushed for bigger laughs, Wilder pulled back. He delivered his lines with a gentleness that felt almost out of place in the noise around him. That contrast was the point. In a film where everything is loud and exaggerated, the Waco Kid's quietness reads as sanity. And in a world as absurd as Rock Ridge, sanity is the funniest thing of all. Mel Brooks ran his sets with a philosophy that made most studio executives deeply uncomfortable. He believed that the best comedy could not be fully scripted, because the best comedy came from people responding to each other honestly in real time. He encouraged his actors to improvise, to go off the written page when something better occurred to them in the moment, to follow the energy of a scene wherever it led. On the Blazing Saddles set, this created an atmosphere that was somewhere between a professional film production and a very well-funded theatrical experiment. Wilder thrived in this environment. Several of the Waco Kid's most memorable moments were not in the original script. His timing, the specific rhythms of his pauses, the way he would let silence sit in a scene far longer than felt comfortable before delivering a line, those were choices he made on the day. Brooks watched the rushes and left them exactly as they were. He understood that Wilder was doing something that could not be improved in the editing room. One of the things Wilder spoke about in later years was how much he and Cleon Little developed their chemistry simply by spending time together between takes. Little had come to the role from a Broadway background, trained, disciplined, technically precise. Wilder came from a more instinctual place. The two styles should not have fit together easily, and yet they did almost immediately because both men were committed to the same goal. They were not trying to be funny. They were trying to be real inside a completely unreal situation. The laughs came from that commitment. Wilder also talked about the specific challenge of playing a character defined by passivity in a film defined by energy. The Waco Kid does not drive the plot. He does not solve problems or take charge. He supports Bart, advises him occasionally, and mostly bears witness to the chaos with that serene, slightly amused expression. A less thoughtful actor might have found this frustrating. Wilder found it liberating. He said that it was one of the few times in his career where he felt truly free on screen because the character had no agenda. He was just watching the world do its thing. The ending of Blazing Saddles is one of the most famous in comedy history. The story breaks through the walls of its own fiction, characters pour off the Warner Brothers backlit and into the real world, and Mel Brooks caps the whole thing with a deliberate, gleeful dismantling of every convention the film spent 90 minutes building. It is chaotic and brilliant and completely intentional. But there is something in that ending that almost nobody discusses when they talk about what Gene Wilder understood about the film. When Bart and the Waco Kid ride off together at the end, they do not ride off into the sunset of the Old West. They ride off into a Hollywood limousine. The joke is obvious enough. What is less obvious is what Wilder said it meant to him. In interviews, Wilder reflected on that final moment as the film's honest confession. The whole movie, he said, had been about the way stories lie. Westerns lie about heroism. They lie about history. They lie about who matters and who is just scenery. Blazing Saddles told the truth by making the lies visible, by pushing them until they collapsed under their own weight. And the ending was the film admitting, openly and without apology, that it was a movie, that everything you had just watched was constructed, that the people who made it knew exactly what they were doing and wanted you to know that they knew. Wilder said that the Waco Kid was in some ways the audience's representative inside the film. A man watching events unfold with awareness, with perspective, with the knowledge that the story around him was a story. When they drove away in the limousine, it felt right to him. Because the Waco Kid had always been slightly outside the world of the film, observing it rather than being consumed by it. That ending put him exactly where he belonged. Gene Wilder lived long enough to see Blazing Saddles become a kind of film that gets discussed in film schools and cultural retrospectives, the kind of film that people argue about and write essays about and return to again and again, trying to figure out why it still works when so many comedies from the same era have aged badly or disappeared entirely. He had clear thoughts about why it lasted. He said it was not because the jokes were timeless. Some of them were very much of their time, rooted in the specific anxieties and arguments of 1970s America. What made it last, he argued, was the honesty underneath the jokes. Mel Brooks was not using comedy as a shield. He was using it as a weapon, pointed directly at the comfortable fictions that American culture had built around race, heroism, and history. The reason audiences 50 years later still feel something when they watch Blazing Saddles is that those fictions are still with us. The targets Brooks was aiming at have not disappeared. They have just changed shape. Wilder also spoke about what it meant to make a film that the studio actively did not want to exist. Brooks had final cut authority written into his contract, which meant that Warner Brothers could not touch the film without his permission. When executives saw the finished product and panicked, when they called it too vulgar and too risky, and began making quiet plans to bury it in a limited release, Brooks held firm. Wilder said that watching Brooks fight for the film taught him something about what it meant to actually believe in your work, not the polished, diplomatic version of belief that you perform for studios and journalists, the raw, stubborn, slightly irrational belief that what you made is right and that the people telling you otherwise are wrong. The film opened in February 1974. It became the highest-grossing comedy of that year. The studio that had planned to quietly let it die scrambled to expand distribution as fast as they could. Brooks had been right, and Wilder, the last-minute replacement who flew in under emergency conditions and started filming the next day, had helped make it happen. Gene Wilder's insight into Blazing Saddles was never really a secret. He spoke about it openly in interviews across several decades. But it is the kind of insight that is easy to hear and hard to truly absorb, because it requires looking past the surface of a film that presents itself as pure, exhilarating chaos. Underneath the fart jokes and the fourth wall breaks and the Yiddish-speaking Native Americans and the campfire beans, there is a film that is completely serious about what it is doing. Every bit of the apparent madness is controlled. Every moment of chaos was deliberate. And the quiet man in the jail cell, watching it all with that half-smile and those knowing eyes, understood that better than anyone. When Wilder said that the Waco Kid was the one person in the film who could see clearly, he was also describing what Mel Brooks hoped the audience would feel by the end. Not just